January morning, 1943. The sky over the North Sea was a uniform sheet of pewter, the kind of lightless grey that seemed to swallow sound. In the cockpit of a Boeing B-17F, its nose art barely visible beneath a layer of frost, Captain Harold "Red" Morgan adjusted the throttles with gloved hands, stiff from the cold. 3 engines hummed at different pitches. The fourth, number 2, was dead, its propeller feathered, turning only from the slipstream. Below them, the clouds parted just enough for a glimpse of the sea, a dull metallic surface littered with patches of white foam, each wave a potential grave marker. The bomber was 200 miles off the English coast, limping home from a raid over Wilhelmshaven. The radio operator, Staff Sergeant Leonard Jones, was trying to raise Bassingbourn. His voice came through the intercom in clipped bursts of static. "Still no contact, Skipper. I'll keep trying. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from." And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Morgan didn't answer. He knew that even if they made it to friendly airspace, landing a 75-foot wide bomber with one engine outboard gone and a second coughing smoke was a calculation more than a decision. But what astonished the German fighters that had broken off the pursuit 10 minutes earlier wasn't that the flying fortress still flew. It was how it flew. They'd seen B-17 seconds return home on a single engine before, wings shredded, fuselage perforated like Swiss cheese. They'd watched in disbelief as the American bombers, trailing vapor and oil, simply refused to die. For Luftwaffe pilots trained to believe their own machines, the Heinkel He 111, the Dornier Doe 17, and the later Junkers Ju 88 represented the pinnacle of precision German engineering. It was a deeply unsettling sight. How could an aircraft that looked so crude, so heavy, so overbuilt simply refuse to fall? The answer would reveal one of the most profound differences between two nations at war. Not merely a difference of materials or engines, but of philosophy. To understand that moment, you have to go back almost a decade earlier, to the early 1930s, before war had even begun. Across the Atlantic, in Seattle, Washington, the Boeing company was building a prototype for a bomber that the United States Army Air Corps hadn't even officially asked for. The competition was for a twin-engine bomber, something light, efficient, economical. Boeing's engineers decided to ignore those requirements entirely. They proposed 4 engines, a radical concept at the time, arguing that safety through redundancy was worth the cost in complexity. When the Model 299, later designated the B-17, first took to the air in July of 1935, its sleek lines and retractable landing gear made it look futuristic. But what truly impressed the Air Corps test pilots wasn't its speed, it was its forgiveness. The machine could lose an engine, even 2, and still maintain altitude. It could absorb punishment and remain controllable. Boeing called it the Flying Fortress, and the name, coined by a Seattle Times journalist, stuck because it wasn't hyperbole. By contrast, in Germany, a very different doctrine was taking shape. The Luftwaffe, rebuilt in secret after the Treaty of Versailles, was being shaped not by engineers, but by theorists, men like General Walter Weaver and later Ernst Udet, who envisioned fast, medium bombers striking deep into enemy territory at lightning speed. The German war machine prized efficiency, precision, and above all, offense. Its early bombers were designed for short, rapid strikes, not long endurance or survivability. The philosophy was simple. You shouldn't need to fly home on one engine if you destroy your enemy before he can shoot you down. In 1936, when the Heinkel He 111 prototype flew, it represented this ideal perfectly twin-engined, sleek, with a glazed cockpit and an aerodynamic silhouette. It was faster than anything the Americans were fielding at the time. The Junkers Ju 88 followed soon after, capable of over 300 miles per hour, its all-metal monocoque fuselage an engineering marvel. To the German designers, speed was armor, and precision bombing guided by disciplined formation Flying was the key to victory. For a while, it worked. During the Blitz over Britain in 1940 and 1941, German bombers dominated the night sky. But even then, cracks were forming in the foundation of that philosophy. When a Heinkel or Dornier took a hit from flak, there was no forgiveness in its design. A single cannon shell through an engine nacelle often meant fire. A direct hit on the fuselage could split the frame like an eggshell. They were elegant machines built with the confidence of a nation that believed wars were won by striking fast and decisively, not by surviving the long grind of attrition. In America, the attitude was different. The Army Air Corps expected attrition. They expected their bombers to be outnumbered, isolated, and attacked relentlessly. Their solution wasn't to build faster aircraft, it was to build enduring ones. Inside every B-17 lay a philosophy of over-engineering so profound that German intelligence analysts, upon examining captured wrecks, were convinced the Americans were wasting aluminum. Each wing spar was built with margins exceeding what the stress tests demanded. Hydraulic systems were duplicated. Electrical controls were isolated. Even the oxygen lines had redundancies built in. It was, as one Luftwaffe engineer would later remark after inspecting a downed B-17, a machine built to return home against the will of physics itself. But the most striking difference of all lay not in the metal, but in the doctrine that shaped it. By the winter of 1942, when the 8th Air Force began operations over Europe, the American doctrine of daylight precision bombing demanded that crews stay in tight formations, flying straight and level for the bomb run despite the flak and fighters. It was suicidal discipline. Yet, the men trusted their aircraft, trusted that even if they were hit, the fortress could bring them back. In contrast, German bomber crews flying over England the previous year had no such faith. They operated mostly at night, relying on speed and stealth rather than armour or redundancy. If their Heinkel lost one engine, performance dropped catastrophically. Lose two, and it was over. And here lay the irony that would define the air war over Europe. The nation that built its bombers on mathematical precision produced machines that could not forgive error. The nation that built on intuition and redundancy produced machines that forgave almost everything. By early 1943, the evidence was already mounting in American airfields scattered across East Anglia. At Bassingbourn, Alconbury, and Thurley, ground crews towed back aircraft that looked impossible wings, missing large sections, tails nearly severed, engines gone. Some had more than 1,000 holes in their fuselages. Yet, time and again, the logbook entry remained the same. Returned to base. One of the most famous of these survivors was a B-17F, nicknamed All-American. After colliding mid-air with a German fighter over Tunisia, its tail was nearly sheared off, connected to the fuselage by a few strips of aluminum. Photographs taken of its return became legendary, showing daylight through the fuselage where the metal had been torn away. Still, the aircraft landed safely. American newspapers made it a symbol of industrial might. To the men who flew her, it was something deeper, a reminder that their machine, though imperfect and heavy, wanted to survive. Meanwhile, across occupied Europe, German crews were discovering the opposite. When a Ju-88 took hits from defensive fire, its sleek airframe, designed for aerodynamic efficiency, transmitted shock loads throughout the fuselage. Structural failure came suddenly, catastrophically. Many crews had no time to bail out. This contrast, the flying fortress limping home on one engine, the German bomber disintegrating after a single hit, wasn't just material. It was psychological. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A downed German pilot, interrogated after the raid on Münster in October of 1943, was asked what he thought of the American bombers. His response was terse but revealing, "They are like iron mountains. We shoot them, but they keep coming." For the Luftwaffe, whose own factories were already strained by resource shortages and strategic bombing, this was more than a technical problem. It was a crisis of belief. In the hangars at Boeing Field back in the United States, engineers continued to receive reports from combat units. They studied the returning aircraft with the precision of surgeons. Bullet trajectories were mapped, armor placements revised, wiring rerouted. Yet the core of the B-17's philosophy never changed. Strength through redundancy. Weight was the price of survival, and the American industrial machine could afford it. By contrast, the German war economy could not. Aluminum was rationed. High-grade alloys were reserved for fighters. Bombers were built with increasingly thinner skin and lighter components. Late-war variants of the Ju-88 and He-111 carried more weight in explosives, but less in protection. Even the vaunted Heinkel He-177, Germany's only true four-engine heavy bomber, was crippled by a catastrophic design decision. Its four engines were paired into two units to reduce drag, a choice that made overheating and engine fires almost inevitable. Pilots called it the flaming coffin. The irony could not have been sharper. The Germans, masters of mechanical precision, had engineered themselves into fragility. The Americans, often derided as crude mass producers, had engineered resilience. By the spring of 1943, the 8th Air Force was losing bombers at a terrifying rate, sometimes more than 20% on a single mission. Yet for every fortress that didn't return, another limped home, riddled and smoking, its crew alive. The stories spread like folklore among the airmen. A fortress that lost its nose in a collision but still landed. Another that flew 300 miles with two engines dead. Another that returned from Bremen with half its tail missing. Each tale reinforced a quiet faith, that the machine beneath them was more than metal and rivets. It was a companion in survival. And in the silent calculus of war, that faith mattered. In the spring of 1943, the air war over Europe had entered its most brutal phase. For the men of the 8th Air Force, daylight bombing was no longer an experiment in doctrine. It was survival, measured in engine revolutions and oxygen flow. The missions grew longer, the flak thicker, the fighter opposition more determined. Yet the question that had begun to trouble German engineers wasn't about strategy. It was about structure. Why did the B-17, a plane nearly twice the empty weight of a Heinkel, He-111, remain airborne after sustaining damage that should have rendered it unflyable? The answer lay in the unseen mathematics of resilience. Boeing's engineers had built the B-17 around a fail-safe philosophy, a concept that in the 1930s was still largely theoretical. The idea was simple. No single point of failure should doom the aircraft. Each critical system, hydraulics, electrics, controls, was either duplicated or designed to degrade gracefully under damage. The main wing spar, forged from heat-treated 24ST aluminum alloy, ran continuously through the fuselage, forming a single, unbroken spine. The load-bearing structure of the B-17 wasn't just metal, it was geometry. The wing's internal truss dispersed stress across multiple pathways. If one section failed, the load redistributed itself through riveted joints that flexed rather than snapped. By comparison, the German He-111 and Ju-88 employed lighter monocoque designs, beautifully efficient but brittle. Stress loads concentrated along narrow structural members. When those were breached by cannon shells, there was no redistribution, only rupture. The difference could be measured in seconds of survival. For the B-17, structural failure might begin slowly, twisting, bending, but not instantly fatal. For the German bombers, it was often catastrophic, one moment flying, the next disintegrating. The Americans had accepted the weight penalty. Each fortress carried nearly 3,000 pounds more and structural reinforcement than was strictly necessary, but that surplus became salvation. Inside the cockpit, the difference was equally profound. The B-17's control system was a maze of cables and pulleys, heavy, manual, and mechanically redundant. The pilots complained that it felt like wrestling a bull, but that physicality had a purpose. In the event of hydraulic failure, the controls still functioned. Every movement of the yoke transmitted directly through cables to the control surfaces. There was no dependency on fluid pressure. German bombers, designed for crew comfort and lighter handling, increasingly used hydraulically assisted controls, quicker to respond, smoother in flight until a shell severed a hydraulic line. Then the aircraft became uncontrollable in seconds. The same principle applied to fuel systems. American engineers installed self-sealing fuel tanks lined with rubberized layers that swelled upon contact with gasoline, choking leaks. The Luftwaffe adopted similar technology later, but their tanks were smaller, and the space to install thicker liners simply didn't exist without compromising payload. Even the engines told the same story. The Wright Cyclone R 1,820 radial engines that powered the B-17 were air-cooled, bulky, yes, but able to absorb extraordinary punishment. A hit that punctured a cylinder might cause oil leaks and loss of power, but rarely fire. German bombers, on the other hand, relied primarily on liquid-cooled inline engines like the Daimler-Benz DB601 and Junkers Jumo 211. They were marvels of precision, smooth, efficient, and powerful. But a single bullet through a coolant line meant a slow, irreversible death. Boiling glycol, loss of pressure, seizure. The Americans could fly home on one good engine. The Germans couldn't fly home with one bad hose. The irony deepened with each passing month of the air campaign. In late 1943, the Allies began recovering significant numbers of downed Luftwaffe bombers intact. Engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough examined them in meticulous detail. Their report, dated December of that year, noted something striking. The German aircraft were magnificently crafted but lacking in redundancy. Each component functioned at near theoretical efficiency, but when damaged, failed without secondary compensation. It was the ultimate paradox of German engineering. The same precision that made their machines beautiful made them brittle. In contrast, the British and American evaluation of damaged B-17 seconds revealed something almost grotesque: torn fuselages, still structurally sound, wings holed like lace but retaining lift. The aircraft's designers had not aimed for perfection. They had aimed for forgiveness, and that forgiveness began to shape not only the air war, but the minds of those who fought it. By the time the 91st Bomb Group flew its mission to Münster in October of 1943, same day that All American returned from Tunisia months before the myth of the indestructible fortress was already gospel among crews. They spoke of the aircraft as if it possessed a will of its own. "She'll bring you home," they said, and for many, she did. At the same time, captured German bomber crews were revealing a starkly different emotional landscape. Allied intelligence interviews, preserved in transcripts at the National Archives, show that morale among Luftwaffe bomber units plummeted by mid-1942. One pilot of Kampfgeschwader 55 described the experience of flying a He-111 over Britain. "You knew if a shell hit the wing, it would burn. If it hit the engine, it would explode. You flew quickly, and you prayed. But you did not believe in the airplane." That statement, "you did not believe in the airplane," encapsulated the psychological divide. For German bomber crews, their machine was a tool, efficient, obedient, but fragile. For American crews, the machine was a partner, cumbersome, loud, but loyal. That loyalty, or the illusion of it, mattered in the freezing upper atmosphere, where human nerves frayed as easily as aluminum skin. Technically, the comparison extended even further. B-17's power plant assembly was mounted with armor plate shielding behind each engine nacelle, protecting fuel and oil lines from direct hits. Its oxygen system was partitioned into multiple loops, ensuring that damage to one side of the fuselage didn't asphyxiate the entire crew. The aircraft's electrical systems, particularly the magnetos that powered the ignition, were isolated per engine, with mechanical backups. Even the landing gear could be hand-cranked if hydraulics failed. These were not luxuries. They were design philosophies rooted in the American industrial mindset. Machinery should tolerate human error and mechanical abuse. The German approach, by contrast, stemmed from a culture of precision, craftsmanship that valued efficiency and obedience to design intent. Systems were optimized, not duplicated. Maintenance crews were highly trained because the aircraft demanded it. They operated perfectly until the moment perfection was impossible. The price of that difference became apparent during the Luftwaffe's own strategic bombing campaigns. In 1942, when the German High Command launched Operation Steinbock, often called the Baby Blitz, they sought revenge for Allied bombings of German cities. Hundreds of Ju-88 seconds and He-177 seconds flew against London, but by then, the RAF's night fighters and radar-directed defences were devastatingly effective. Losses among German bomber crews soared to unsustainable levels. In a post-war interview, General Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's famed fighter ace, reflected bitterly, "We could build aircraft of elegance, but not of endurance. We did not understand that war would punish elegance. That punishment came, not only from Allied guns, but from materials science itself." Germany faced chronic shortages of strategic metals by late 1943. High-tensile aluminum alloys were replaced with softer substitutes. Rivets failed under stress. Crews began reporting airframe cracks after only a few missions. Meanwhile, in America, the arsenal of democracy was producing nearly 13 B-17 seconds per day, each identical, each tested beyond specifications. Industrial mass production, derided by the German engineers as soulless, had become an instrument of survival. For American aircrews, survival was not guaranteed, but possible. The difference between returning or vanishing over the North Sea often came down to that single word: possible. In January of 1944, Lieutenant Kenneth Dow of the 390th Bomb Group recorded in his journal after limping home from Brunswick on 2 engines. "You learn to listen to her breathing. When she's hurt, you feel it. But as long as the wings can hold and one prop still turning, you keep believing she'll make it. And somehow, she does." It was not sentimentality. It was empirical experience. They had seen their machines defy physics too many times to call it luck. For the Germans, by contrast, the sense of inevitability grew. After the disastrous raid on Stalingrad in the winter of 1942, where supply Ju-52 transports were shot down in droves, trying to feed the encircled Sixth Army, the Luftwaffe's bomber branch effectively ceased to exist as an offensive force. Hitler's obsession with single-engine fighters drained resources from bomber development. The few heavy designs that did emerge, the He-177, the Ju-188, the Dornier Do 217, were plagued by mechanical failures, engine fires, structural cracks, cooling issues. They were aircraft that embodied the contradictions of their creation, theoretically superior, but practically suicidal. And so, when German crews witnessed B-17 seconds returning from missions with 1 or even 2 engines dead, tails shredded, fuselages gaping, they saw not just an enemy machine, but an alternate universe of engineering philosophy. A machine that refused to die not because it was perfect, but because it was allowed to be imperfect. By late 1944, even German civilians noticed the contrast. In the wreckage of bombed-out cities, rumors spread about American aircraft that came back from the dead. In interrogation centers, captured airmen spoke of the fortresses that bled oil like wounded whales but never fell. It wasn't just propaganda, it was testimony. The same year, Allied intelligence intercepted a German technical memo circulated within the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, the Ministry of Aviation. The document, dated October of 1944, summarized findings from inspections of downed B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds. Enemy heavy bombers display excessive duplication of systems. Structural components remain intact under their airfall. Extraordinary levels of stress. Material economy is low, but survivability is high. Conclusion: American design prioritizes mission completion and crew recovery over material efficiency. It was, in essence, an admission that the Germans had misunderstood the very nature of endurance. That winter, as the Ardennes froze under the Battle of the Bulge, Allied bombers continued to strike deep into German territory. The Luftwaffe, broken and exhausted, could no longer contest the skies. What few bombers remained flew defensive sorties, reconnaissance, night raids, desperate supply drops. Their crews looked at the vast formations of American fortresses overhead and knew that their own aircraft could never have sustained such punishment. And within that knowledge was a quiet recognition, a recognition that the war in the air had been decided not by speed or firepower, but by the deeper principle of belief, that machines could be made human enough to endure error, chaos, and time. By the time the last B-17 seconds returned from their final missions in the spring of 1945, the world below them had already changed forever. Cities were dust, nations exhausted, and the sky itself, once a symbol of mastery, had become a graveyard of ambition. Yet among the scattered survivors of the air war, something remarkable had taken root: respect. Even German officers, hardened by years of conflict, spoke with quiet admiration of the American flying fortress. At war's end, captured airframes were examined not as spoils but as lessons. German engineers ran their hands along the torn aluminum skin, tracing the rivet lines, noting how panels bent instead of breaking, how spars were thicker than necessary. They were looking at the future they hadn't built. When peace came, the engineers who had designed these machines went back to their drafting boards, some in Seattle, others in Stuttgart, Munich, and Hamburg. The lessons of failure and endurance were still fresh in their qualities, minds. At Boeing, Chief Engineer Edward Wells was already applying what he called the fortress principle to a new generation of aircraft. The B-29 Superfortress, then the Stratocruiser, and later the B-52 Stratofortress, all carried the same genetic code: structural redundancy, overbuilt joints, and multiple fail-safes. These weren't stylistic choices, they were the direct descendants of the B-17's wounds. Every hole patched with aluminum, every plane that limped home on a single engine became data. Every crew that lived to tell the story became proof of concept. Meanwhile, in post-war Germany, the aviation industry, stripped to its foundations, began to rebuild under Allied supervision. Engineers like Ludwig Bölkow and Willy Messerschmitt found themselves in a new kind of apprenticeship, studying American methods not with bitterness, but with fascination. The obsession with perfect form gave way to a new respect for functional imperfection. In the decades that followed, the B-17's legacy would echo in the unlikeliest places. When Boeing's engineers designed the B-52, they deliberately accepted structural redundancy that critics called inefficient. The plane was heavier, slower to climb, and consumed more fuel than its Soviet counterparts. But it could survive damage, fly with failed systems, and still deliver its payload. Sound familiar? The Soviet Union's bombers, sleek, fast, precisely built, looked magnificent on parade, but in practice, they shared the same weakness that had doomed the Luftwaffe: fragility under stress. The B-52, like the B-17 before it, was never the most elegant aircraft in the sky. But 70 years after its first flight, it remains in service, an imperfect machine made perfect by its refusal to die. That was the invisible inheritance of the B-17, the engineering of forgiveness. And yet, perhaps the greater legacy wasn't in metal at all, but in memory. When crews from both sides met after the war at reunions, air shows, or quiet moments in the shadow of restored aircraft, they often said the same thing in different words. For the Americans, she brought us home. For the Germans, ours were fast, but they burned. Those weren't just reflections on machines, they were moral reckonings. The B-17 represented a belief that technology should protect the fallible human being who used it. The German bombers, products of a culture that valued precision and obedience, demanded perfection and punished weakness. In that contrast lay a story far larger than the war itself, a story about the purpose of engineering and the duty of those who create. Today, when you stand beneath a restored B-17, its wings stretching 30 feet above you, its skin pocked with the scars of old repairs, you can feel that philosophy embodied in metal. Each rivet, each scar, is an argument against despair. Visitors often ask veterans why they trusted those airplanes so deeply. One old gunner from the 303rd Bomb Group answered quietly at a museum event in 1982, because she believed in us even when we didn't believe in ourselves. He meant it literally. When every gauge failed and every vibration screamed that the ship should have fallen apart, it didn't. It held together long enough for its crew to live and to remember. Modern aerospace design has become far more complex than the B-17's engineers could ever have imagined. Fly-by-wire systems, carbon fiber composites, computer-aided stress analysis, all tools of a world they could barely foresee. And yet, at the heart of every Boeing 787 Dreamliner, every Airbus A350, every spacecraft leaving Earth, there remains that same quiet principle: redundancy. No single point of failure, no reliance on perfection. It's an inheritance not of technology, but of humility. For the designers who watched the B-17 crawl home through flak and fire, learned the most timeless engineering truth of all that perfection is not resilience, and that strength is not in the unbroken, but in the unbreakable will to endure. In 1943, after its famous mission over Tunisia, the crippled B-17 All-American was photographed flying home with half its tail sheared away. The picture ran in newspapers across the United States, a jagged silhouette of defiance against a bright Mediterranean sky. To this day, historians debate how it stayed airborne. Aerodynamic analysis offers theories, but no certainty. Perhaps that's fitting. Because the B-17 story was never just about lift, or metallurgy, or airspeed. It was about faith. Faith in design. Faith in human ingenuity. Faith that, even in the darkest moments of destruction, something built with care and courage could still find its way home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.